Little Carmine's public persona is the gift that keeps on giving. A man who can turn a direct sentence into a fog bank of mixed metaphors and accidental self-parody, then stand back and admire the confusion as if it were statesmanship. Conveniently, that unintentional buffoon posture also functions as camouflage for someone who understands exactly what a room needs to hear in order to ignite. The sit-down between Phil Leotardo and Tony Soprano is usually remembered as another occasion where Carmine Jr. tries to sound diplomatic and instead produces linguistic debris. But the cleaner reading is that the debris is the point. The meeting collapses because it is quietly engineered to collapse. The motive is not some abstract policy preference for chaos or a vague appetite for war. It is personal, specific, and therefore far more credible. Rusty Millio. The subtext is that Rusty's murder, along with collateral bodies like Lorraine Caluso and the cousin, sits like a stone in Carmine's throat, and the sit-down gives him a stage to make that stone everyone else's problem. The phrasing about incidents that have expired is not merely a malapropism. It is a conspicuous framing device that takes killings and turns them into a ledger of debts. Rusty is mentioned by name, which is not what a man does when he is sincerely trying to reduce temperature. Tony and Phil exchange a look, because they know exactly why the name lands with weight. The collusion is visible to the people who matter, and Carmine knows it. The line about "for reasons that will be discerned in time" functions like a polite threat delivered through a mouth that can always claim it was only trying to sound important. The supposed nonsense proverb, "a pint of blood costs more than a gallon of gold," stops sounding like babble the moment it is treated as theme rather than comedy. Blood is the actual currency in this world. Money is merely the accounting. If blood costs more than gold, then Rusty's blood and the blood of those expired incidents are not a set of unfortunate complications that can be smoothed with envelopes. They are debts that cannot be satisfied by cash, and the point is not metaphorical elegance. The point is that some debts are paid in escalation. That leads to the line everyone quotes because it lands with the precision of a thumb pressed into a bruise. Whatever happened there? The charitable reading is that Carmine blurts it out because he is Carmine, then tries to bandage the damage with "God rest his soul." The sharper reading is that the blurting is a blade. Whatever happened there is not an accident. It is a calculated provocation aimed at Phil's ego, grievance addiction, and self-pity. Phil detonates immediately because Phil is built to detonate, and Carmine knows that. The so-called half-hearted de-escalation afterward reads less like remorse and more like the theatrical cleanup required to preserve plausible deniability, the kind of performance that says with a straight face that the match just happened to fall into the gasoline. The most interesting extension of the sabotage thesis is not that Carmine is secretly brilliant in a cartoonish way, but that he is petty, emotionally motivated, and socially protected enough to weaponize his own underestimation. That is not 4D chess. It is a far more realistic skill set. The ability to hide behind the mask of an oaf while quietly nudging volatile men into self-destruction. That reading also explains why the sit-down feels like an exception to his usual clown act. Even a man who talks in spirals can sharpen when the subject is betrayal and blood, and the show repeatedly rewards the idea that the most dangerous people are not always the loudest, but the ones everyone finds too ridiculous to fear. The next question, inevitably, is whether this is a solo operation or a coordinated one. The tantalizing detail is the glance upward after Phil storms out, an apparent look to someone off-camera, interpreted as Butchie DeConcini. It reads like a micro check-in between people who prefer to keep their hands clean. the kind of fleeting confirmation that says the intended reaction occurred. From there, the theory builds an alliance. Carmine and Butchie as the survivors who quietly shape the post-war landscape. The appeal is obvious. Butchie is pragmatic enough to prioritize stability and self-preservation, and Carmine is socially positioned as the last big name left standing in New York's pond. That dynamic would naturally invite accommodation, even if it is not romanticized as friendship. Still, the useful correction is that none of this requires Carmine to be a hidden genius, and forcing him into that costume undercuts the series' central thesis about decline. The show is far more consistent with a world where mediocrity rises on family connections, where bosses are sometimes spoiled heirs rather than masterminds, and where the smart move is often simply refusing to be the most visible target. Carmine's strength is not tactical brilliance. It is self-awareness, insulation, and a capacity for small, plausible, spiteful actions that cause larger men to destroy themselves. If Butchie follows anyone, it would more likely be in the way a mechanic tolerates the shiny hood ornament while he runs the engine. A figurehead arrangement fits the show's cynicism. A recognizable name absorbs law enforcement attention, while the real operator manages the machinery. The idea that Butchie would puppet Carmine, using him as a distraction in the way Tony once let an older figure absorb heat, is not only plausible, it is almost inevitable in a world that treats leadership as a marketing problem. That said, the series also delights in exposing the audience's hunger for neat diagrams. The house trick imagery, the suggestion of a hidden operator, the wizard behind the curtain, the man at the door controlling access, practically begs for a conspiracy storyboard where Butchie whispers to Phil and Carmine smirks in the margins. The problem is that The Sopranos rarely rewards clean, mechanistic explanations. Violence is messy. Human beings are inconsistent. Plans are interrupted by ego, appetite, stupidity, and coincidence. In that ecosystem, the more credible version of conspiracy is not a flawless scheme, but an opportunistic understanding. Let the hotheads burn themselves out, then step into the vacuum with clean hands and a public story about peace. Phil's death underscores that worldview with brutal clarity, and it does so with a deliberate edge of absurdity. The staging strips him of the grandeur he believes he deserves. He goes out complaining about a medication prescription, as if the universe owes him pharmacy-level customer service at the precise moment it is collecting payment for a war he helped start. The reaction around him is chaos with a cartoonish timing. The delayed shock, the frantic back and forth, the sudden pivot from husband to grandchildren, the car crawling forward at a pathetic speed, and then the grotesque indignity of the head under the wheel. It is ugly and funny in the way real horror can be, and that is exactly the point. The series repeatedly frames violence as both terrifying and surreal. Tony and Ralphie swinging a frying pan, chemical spray turning a death struggle into slapstick, the random attacker with a chainsaw turning the woods into a lunatic theater, botched hits and clumsy courage, including the Mustang Sally incident where age, panic, and brutality collide in a scene that refuses to look cool. Even the idea that someone uninvolved, Vito's brother for instance, gets maimed or killed simply by being nearby, is part of the show's moral accounting. This world's violence is not contained, not principled, and certainly not glamorous. Phil's end is undignified because the show rejects the fantasy that men like Phil deserve anything else. That same rejection powers the finale debate, where Tony Soprano's fate at Holston's is treated by some as a mystery, and by others as a conclusion the show nearly underlines. The argument that Tony is killed does not rely on a single smoking gun. It relies on the accumulated logic of the world and the construction of the scene. The peace deal that precedes the diner feels rushed and thin, a handshake without enforcement, in a culture that treats agreement as a temporary pause before someone needs to save face. Phil never meaningfully agreed to anything, but even that may be beside the point, because the machinery of violence does not halt cleanly. There could still be hitters who never got the memo, men operating on momentum and habit, seeing Tony in a public place and taking the shot, because that is what the ecosystem trains them to do. Or, if the hit is deliberate, retaliation remains abundant. Phil is killed in front of his family, in a way that denies him awareness and dignity. And the show makes it easy to imagine someone close to Phil, or someone who needs to look strong after Phil's humiliation, choosing Tony as the balancing payment. The structural parallel is explicit. If the viewer were trapped in Phil's point of view, the moment would be an abrupt void. The finale offers the same cruelty for Tony. The repeated door chime, Tony's reflexive head turns, the pattern of scanning, the camera's insistence on who enters and what Tony sees, and the sudden cut to black, all function as the show's final lecture. Death does not announce itself with a cinematic flourish. It simply removes the viewpoint. That is why the cut feels harsh, why the silence during the credits unsettles, and why the fear it evokes can be described as more frightening than horror. The scene invites contemplation of a possibility that is harder to comfort. The idea that in death there may be nothing at all. No afterlife soundtrack, no closing speech, only the abrupt end of perception. The finale's pacing is engineered to make that insight physical. Meadows' parking delay becomes a torture mechanism. The music becomes a metronome of dread. The camera keeps returning to the act of looking, of noticing, of trying to anticipate. And then it denies the payoff in the only way that truly resembles real death. It removes the experience itself. The members-only jacket man becomes the most notorious exhibit because the staging practically points at him. In a diner where others seem not to register Tony's entrance, he looks toward Tony's perspective, glances again, sits with an oddly purposeful stillness, then heads to the bathroom in a move that feels like genre shorthand for a hidden gun and a practiced exit. The reference is almost too obvious. The bathroom ritual, the echo of classic mafia cinema, the nod that tells the audience exactly what kind of story this is, and exactly how such stories end. And still, because The Sopranos delights in forcing ambiguity into certainty, the show also allows the possibility that the man is merely a red herring, that Tony dies by a different hand, or that Tony's death is less about the specific shooter and more about the fact that the life he built has reached its logical terminus. That is why the debate expands into suspects and betrayals. Patsy Parisi, Paulie Galtieri, Butchie, stray hitmen, lingering orders, and the many enemies Tony accumulated through greed, humiliation, and collateral damage. Patsy has the cleaner motive, a long-held grievance over his twin brother's death, a temperament suited to waiting, and a plausible access point through Meadows' relationship with his son, which could reveal where the family eats. Paulie is the more seductive suspect because he is always adjacent to betrayal without ever looking like a mastermind. The idea that New York discusses taking out the top three in Jersey, Tony, Silvio, Bobby, while someone explicitly says no on Paulie, invites suspicion. Either Paulie is irrelevant, or Paulie is protected. The counter-argument, which is equally consistent with the show's portrait of him, is that Paulie is not important enough anymore to justify the cost, especially if he has been sidelined from leadership and has fewer major rackets. Sparing him could simply be efficient, leaving a nostalgic, unambitious, easily managed older man is better than creating another vacuum. The theory of Paulie as a turncoat also runs headlong into his demonstrated limitations. He is impulsive, superstitious, and often embarrassingly foolish. He is burned when he tries to play both sides, and his loyalty reads less like virtue than like sentimental inertia and vanity about his place in the story. Even if he would not personally whack a boss, betrayal does not require pulling the trigger. It can mean setting conditions, passing information, or simply stepping aside. The point is not to crown a definitive traitor, but to show how thoroughly the world corrodes trust. The show even supplies symbolic garnish for that corrosion. The cat late in the series is interpreted as a rat sniffer, a quiet animal presence that seems to hover around guilt and suspicion. Polly's discomfort with it becomes another minor indictment, and the final image of Polly sitting alone with the cat beside him reads as very allegorical, without requiring a theology degree. Whether he betrayed Tony or merely survived him, the outcome is the same: isolation, diminished power, and the bleak reward of being left behind. The commentary around the finale also drifts into the show's broader symbolism, including references to the season's breadcrumb trail, montage imagery, the Seven Souls sequence, and the notion that AJ's adolescence and eventual maturation are tied to Tony's disappearance, while Carmela is framed as remains, the sleepless survivor left to metabolize the aftermath. Whether every symbolic mapping is intentional, or some is retrofitted by pattern-seeking viewers, the overall effect aligns with the show's point. The family's future is built on absence, and the absence is either literal death or the more complicated death of meaning and stability. That is why the diner being an all-American restaurant matters. A series that lived in Italian restaurants ends in fluorescent Americana with onion rings, as if to underline the theme that the old ethnic enclaves and their old codes are shrinking, fading, and being replaced by a bland, public, exposed version of life. Made in America becomes less a triumphant label than a verdict. This is what the tradition amounts to at the end. Not romantic rituals, but a family at a booth, one moment alive, the next moment gone. The mind naturally wanders into grotesque imagery, brains on onion rings, because the show has trained its audience to see violence intruding on domesticity with casual cruelty. The commentary even reveals how easily serious analysis is punctured by distraction. A stray quip tries to identify the suspicious diner patron as a contemporary political figure, then dismisses it on the grounds of height, as if the only thing separating insight from nonsense is a tape measure. Other asides drift into actor trivia and real-world culinary details, which is charming in its own way, but also illustrative. When a story refuses to provide the comfort of finality, attention scatters into any available substitute, even nostalgia about vodka sauce. What remains after the jokes and the theories and the forensic rewatches is a bleakly coherent picture of a world where loud men die badly, tough guys go out whining about prescriptions, innocents are crushed by proximity, and survival favors those who are underestimated, cautious, and willing to let other people's temperaments do the work. Little Carmine does not need to be a secret genius. He only needs to be self-protective, quietly resentful, and skilled at pushing the right button while keeping his own fingerprints off the panel. Butchie does not need to be a romantic kingmaker. He only needs to be pragmatic enough to accept a new arrangement when the old one becomes a liability. Tony does not need a single, named executioner in order to be doomed. He only needs to have lived the way he lived. That is the show's final insult and its final honesty. In a system built on coercion and humiliation, enemies accumulate faster than safeguards, and the end can come from anywhere, at any time, in any banal setting, with no narration, no warning, and no dignity. The sit-down collapses because a man with a grudge chooses language as a weapon. The war escalates because egos demand theater. The peace feels rushed because it is. And the cut to black is frightening because it refuses to dress up what death is. The abrupt removal of perspective, leaving everyone else to argue about motives, alliances, and who approved what, while the person at the center is simply no longer there. Subscribe!